the archives of southern West Virginia, filed away in acid-free boxes and kept under lock, there are ledgers that the coal companies once kept back when they still owned the men who dug for them. Long black account books, columns of careful handwriting, every single line a debt. And if you sit with one of them long enough, in the quiet of a reading room, you begin to understand that these were never really business records at all. They were a record of ownership of people. Turn the pages, and you can watch a man's entire life reduced to arithmetic. Here is the rent for the house he was allowed to live in. Here is what he owed at the store, paid in money the company printed for itself. Here is the fee for a doctor he never chose. Here is the powder he bought to bring the coal down, and the oil for his lamp, and the tools of a trade he only thought he owned. Line after line, month after month, a man working every day of his life and somehow sinking a little deeper into the hole with each one. And then, near the bottom of some of these pages, you come to an entry that stops you cold. A burial. Because the company did not only write down what a miner earned and what he owed. When the mountain finally killed him, and the mountain killed a great many of them, the company wrote that down too. The plot, the ground he went into. And when his widow came, months later, asking only to be told where her husband had been laid, so that she could set a stone on the place and grieve him properly, she was given an answer that turns this from a sad story into something far colder. She was told the record was company property, not the house. Not the wages he had torn out of the earth with his own hands. The location of her husband's grave. That belonged to the company too, sealed inside a book she was forbidden to open. In a world built so tightly around these people that it reached past the final day of a man's life and took possession of the dirt they buried him in. This is the story of how that was allowed to happen, of the place where a family could be owned from the hour they arrived to the hour they were lowered into the ground, and every hour in between, and of what finally broke loose when 10,000 of them decided they would sooner climb a mountain into machine gun fire than kneel for one more day. It begins the way it began for all of them, with one family arriving in the coalfields carrying everything they owned on their backs, certain that they were walking toward a better life. They came by rail, the way most of them did, riding a coal train up a river valley so tight the sun only reached the bottom of it for a few hours a day. Steep green ridges pressed in on both sides. A black creek ran along the tracks, and strung up the hillside above the tipple stood rows of identical wooden houses, unpainted, built fast and cheap, each one the same as the last. Frank Ballard was a young man then, strong through the shoulders, and he had a wife named Della and the beginnings of a family. They had come from a hard-scrabble farm that could no longer feed them, and they had heard what everyone had heard, that there was work in the coalfields, steady work, cash money, a house waiting for you the day you arrived. And all of that was true. That was the thing about it. Every promise the company made was technically true. There was a house waiting. A superintendent walked them up the muddy path and showed them into a 4-room frame box with a coal stove and a privy out back. It was theirs, he said, and it was, in a manner of speaking. Because the rent for that house would come straight out of Frank's pay, taken off the top before he ever touched a dollar of it. He had not yet swung a pick, and he was already renting from the man he was about to work for. Then the superintendent walked them down to the store. Now, in a normal town, a store is just a store. You go in, you buy what you need, you pay, you leave. But this was the company store, and the company store was the beating heart of the whole machine. And to understand everything that came after, you have to understand how it worked. Because it is the quietest kind of trap ever built, and most of the men caught in it never saw the walls close. Here is how it worked. When Frank Ballard started drawing pay, he did not draw it in United States dollars. He drew it in script, company money, little coins or paper notes stamped with the name of the coal company. And that script was good in exactly one place on this earth, the company store. You could not spend it at a bank. You could not spend it in the next town. You could not save it up and send it home. It was money that only existed inside the walls the company had built around you. And the prices in that store were whatever the company decided they would be. So a man like Frank Ballard would work a full month underground, and on payday, he would find that the rent had already been taken out, and the store bill had already been taken out, and by the time all of it was subtracted, there was often little left, and what little there was came in scrip he could only spend right back at the same store. The money never really left the company's hands. It just made a slow circle, from the company to the miner and back to the company. And every time it went around, the miner fell a little further behind. Think about that for a second. A man could work every day, never miss a shift, never take a drink, do everything right, and still end each month a little deeper in debt than he started it. Not because he was lazy, not because he was foolish, because the game had been designed from the ground up so that he could not win it. There is an old song from those camps about a man who works and only ends up owing his soul to the company store. People sometimes think that line is an exaggeration, a bit of poetry. It was not poetry. It was a description of the accounting. And the debt had a way of growing whether you spent anything or not, because there were the deductions. There was a deduction for the house. There was a deduction for the coal you burned to heat the house, coal you dug yourself, sold back to you by the company that owned it. There was a deduction for your tools, and for the blasting powder you needed to bring the coal down, and for the oil in your lamp. You bought the means of your own labor from the company, at the company's price. And then there was the doctor. Every camp had a company doctor, and every miner paid for him whether he ever saw him or not. A fee came out of every man's wages, month after month, a small amount, automatic, that funded the one physician the company chose. When the mine hurt you, and the mine hurt everyone eventually, that doctor was who you saw. He was decent enough at his job, most likely, but he drew his salary from the company, and a man does not easily bite the hand that pays him. When a miner was killed and the widow wanted to know why, it was often that same company doctor who signed the paper, explaining that the death had been no one's fault. So follow the money one more time, because this is the part that should make your jaw tighten. Frank Ballard rented his house from the company. He bought his food from the company, in the company's money, at the company's prices. He bought the powder and the oil and the tools of his trade from the company. He paid the company's doctor out of every check. His children learned their letters in the company's school, from a teacher the company hired. On Sunday, the family worshipped in the company's church, listening to a preacher the company could dismiss. When there was mail, it came through a post office the company ran. And the land under all of it, every inch, was company land. There was no independent grocer to undercut the store. No competing landlord, no other doctor, no town council that the company did not effectively control, because the town was not a town in any real sense. It was an asset, and Frank Ballard and Della and their children were part of the inventory. For a while they told themselves it was temporary. They would work hard, get ahead, save a little, and one day move on to a place of their own. Nearly everyone told themselves that. But the arithmetic never allowed it, and slowly, without any single terrible day to point to, they began to understand that they were not passing through this place. They lived here now, and they could not afford to leave. That is the trap. There were no walls, no fences, no chains, just numbers in a ledger, arranged so carefully that a free man could wake up one morning and realize he was not free, and never sign a single thing that made it so. Now, if the story ended there, it would only be sad, a hard life in a hard place. But it does not end there, because the men in those hollows were not fools, and they could count. They could see that the coal they dug was worth a fortune somewhere out beyond the ridges, in the cities that were lighting up and the mills that were roaring, and they could see how little of that fortune reached the bottom of the hollow where they lived. And a few of them, quietly, in the dark, began to talk about the one thing the company feared more than anything else in the world. They began to talk about a union. To see why that single word carried so much danger, you have to understand what the men were actually risking, because it was everything. In an ordinary town, if you don't like your job, you quit, and you keep your home, your church, your doctor, your friends. In a coal camp, Your job was your home. Your job was your church and your school and your doctor and the roof over your children. Cross the company, and you did not just lose your wages. You lost your entire world in a single afternoon. And the men who ran the mines knew that. It was the whole point. The work itself was killing them regardless. Down in the dark, a miner lay on his side in a seam sometimes no taller than a kitchen chair, swinging a pick by the light of a single flame, breathing air thick with black dust that would rot his lungs from the inside over 20 years, if the mine gave him 20 years. Above him hung a ceiling of rock and slate held up by nothing but timber and luck. Roof falls crushed men without warning. Pockets of gas ignited and turned tunnels into furnaces. And when a man died down there, the company owed his family, as a rule, nothing at all. There was no pension and no insurance. A death was treated as a private misfortune, and the widow was expected to vacate the company house so the next miner could move in. There was a fight over the very scales that weighed the coal, and it tells you everything about the era. Miners were paid by the ton, so the honest question was, how much did a ton weigh, and who got to say? The companies employed the man at the scale, and there were endless quiet accusations that the scales ran light, that a miner's ton was somehow always a little less than a ton, that dockage for rock and slate was assessed generously against the miner and never in his favor. The union men wanted the right to post their own check weighman at the scale, a man of their own choosing, to watch the weighing. That was one of their central demands. They weren't asking for gold or luxury. They were asking for the right to watch a scale. That is how far the balance had tipped. Men were ready to risk their homes and their lives for the right to make sure they were being cheated a little less. The United Mine Workers had been trying to organize these southern fields for years, and they had been beaten back every time, because the operators of southern West Virginia had drawn a line. The mines to the north were unionizing, but down here, in the Tug and the Guyandotte country, the operators swore the union would never take root, and they had the money and the men to make that promise good. And their men had a name that the miners spoke the way you might speak of a coming storm: Baldwin Felts. The Baldwin Felts Detective Agency was a private outfit out of Bluefield, run by a man named Thomas Felts and his brothers, and the coal operators kept it on the payroll as a private army. Officially, they were detectives and guards. In practice, they were the muscle that kept the coalfields in line. They guarded the mines. They rode the trains and watched for organizers. They ran spies into the camps, men who would take a job swinging a pick and spend their evenings reporting on which of their fellow workers had been talking union. And when the company decided a family had to go, it was the Baldwin Felts men who came to put them out. They had done it before, and the miners had not forgotten. Years earlier, up on Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, the miners had struck, and the operators had answered by evicting them from the company houses in the dead of winter. The families moved into tent colonies along the creeks, and the Baldwin Felts men came at them there too. On one night that passed straight into legend, an armored train fitted with steel plate and machine guns rolled slowly past a tent colony called Holly Grove in the dark, and it opened fire on the tents where families were sleeping. They called that train the Bull Moose Special. It raked a sleeping camp with machine gun fire and rolled on into the night. An old woman named Mary Harris Jones, whom the whole country knew as Mother Jones, had come into those hollows to organize the miners, and she was thrown in a military prison for it, in her 80s. That was the world these men lived in. That was the price of the union word, already paid once in blood, and every miner in the southern fields knew the story by heart. So when the organizing began again, in the camps along the Tug in 1920, everyone understood that it would not stay quiet. The union was signing men up in secret. The operators were compiling lists, and the Baldwin Felts agents were riding the rails, watching, waiting for the order to start the evictions that would break the strike before it began. That order came in the spring of 1920, and it brought them to a little town on the Tug Fork, right on the Kentucky line, called Matewan. Matewan was not a coal camp. That is the first thing that made it dangerous to the operators. It was an actual incorporated town, with its own mayor and its own chief of police. sitting in the middle of the coalfields but not owned by any single company. It had a main street and a rail line and a river at its back, and it had a young police chief who had grown up in these mountains and had once been a miner himself. His name was Sid Hatfield. He was a slight man, quick, always a little bit smiling, with a gold tooth that caught the light. He knew the miners because he was one of them, and when they started signing union cards, Sid Hatfield did not look away. He took their side. So did the mayor of Metewan, a man named Cabell Testerman, and that put the whole town on a collision course with the most feared private army in the state. Because when the Stone Mountain Coal Company decided to evict the Union families from its houses just outside Metewan, it sent Baldwin Felts agents to do it, and on the 19th of May 1920, 13 of them stepped off the morning train, carrying rifles and eviction orders, and they went up the hollow and began putting families out of their homes. They did it the cruel way. They carried furniture out into the rain and set it in the mud. They put women and children out in the road, and two of the men leading them were Albert and Lee Felts, brothers of Thomas Felts who ran the agency, hard men who had done this work for years. By the time they walked back down into Metewan that afternoon to catch the evening train home, word had gone out across the whole valley, and Sid Hatfield was waiting for them. What happened next happened fast, and the exact order of it has been argued over for 100 years, because almost everyone who could have told you the whole truth was about to be dead. Hatfield confronted the agents. He said he had warrants for their arrest. They said they had a warrant for his. Mayor Testerman came out into the street. There were miners gathering, armed, in the doorways and on the corners, because the whole town had turned out. And Albert Felts and Sid Hatfield stood there in the middle of Metewan's main street, two men with the law on their tongues and pistols on their hips, and the space between them got very small. Then a shot went off. To this day, no one can say for certain whose finger pulled first. And then the whole street was firing. It lasted only a minute or two. When the smoke cleared and the echoes died out over the river, 10 men lay dead in the mud of Metewan. 7 of them were Baldwin Felts agents, including both of the Felts brothers, Albert and Lee, shot down in the street they had come to clear. And among the town's dead was its own mayor, Cabell Testerman, who fell wounded and would not live out the day. The most feared detective agency in West Virginia had walked into a coal town to break a union, and it had been shot to pieces on a public street by miners and a police chief who refused to move aside. The coalfields had never seen anything like it, and to the miners, Sid Hatfield became something more than a man. He became proof that the company's guns could be answered, proof that the thing the operators had told them was impossible, standing up to Baldwin Felts and living, could actually be done. His name went up and down every hollow in the southern fields. Miners who would never meet him signed union cards because of him. In a world where the company owned everything, Sid Hatfield had become the one thing it could not buy. If you're finding this story worth your time, take a second to subscribe. This channel digs into the buried history of ordinary people crushed by powerful institutions, the stories the record keepers hoped you'd never hear, and there is a great deal more of it coming. Now, by the fall of 1920, everything had changed, and none of it had changed for the better, because a thing like Metewan does not end a war. It starts one. The operators were not going to let the killing of 7 of their men, and the humiliation of their whole system, simply stand. Thomas Felts had lost 2 brothers on that street, and Thomas Felts was not a man who forgot. Across the coalfields, the strike spread and hardened. Thousands of miners walked out. The operators evicted them, and the tent colonies filled up again along the creeks, families living under canvas through another winter, while the mines ran with imported strikebreakers under the guns of the guards. And there were gun battles. Along the Tug, up in the hills, the strike turned into a low, grinding war of ambush and reprisal that the newspapers took to calling the 3 days battle when it flared into the open. The National Guard came in. Martial law was declared, lifted, and declared again. Men were arrested by the hundreds and held without much in the way of trial. The whole region was becoming a place where the ordinary rules had quietly stopped applying, and everyone could feel it. Through all of it, Sid Hatfield stood at the center, a marked man, and he knew it. He and the other Matawan defendants had gone on trial for the killings of the agents, in a courtroom packed with miners, and they had been acquitted. The company could not beat him in a court of law. He had become too large a symbol, too well loved, for a jury of local people to convict. So the men who wanted him dead were going to have to find another way. There was, in Matawan in those days, a man who ran a little eatery in town, an ordinary-seeming fellow named C.E. Lively. He was friendly. He was one of them, or so everyone believed. He talked Union as loud as anyone, and men trusted him, and they said things in front of him they would not have said in front of a stranger. What none of them knew was that C.E. Lively had been on the Baldwin Felts payroll the entire time. He was a spy, one of the most effective the agency ever ran, and he had spent months living inside the miners' confidence, listening, remembering, reporting. Remember that name, because he is about to walk back into this story on the worst day of it. Here is how they finally got to Sid Hatfield. They did not use a bullet in the dark, or an ambush on a mountain road. They used the law itself. They used the very system the miners were told to trust. There had been another shooting, in a place called Mohawk, over in Mingo County, and Hatfield and his close friend, a fellow Union man named Ed Chambers, were charged in connection with it. To answer the charge, they would have to travel to the county seat over in McDowell County, to the courthouse in the town of Welch. They were told to appear. They were, of course, told to come unarmed. They were going to court, after all, and a man does not carry a gun into a courthouse. Ed Chambers had a wife named Sally. Sid Hatfield, by this time, had a wife too. After Mayor Testerman was killed at Matawan, Sid had married the mayor's widow, Jessie, a fact that his enemies whispered about endlessly and made into all sorts of ugly things. But whatever the truth of that, on the morning of the 1st of August, 1921, the two couples set out together for Welch. Two young miners and their two young wives, going to face the charges against them, unarmed, trusting that inside a county courthouse, in the light of day, the law would at least keep them alive. They arrived at the McDowell County Courthouse and started up the long flight of stone steps toward the doors. Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers walked in front. Their wives came just behind them, and at the top of the steps, waiting, were Baldwin Felts men. Among them was C.E. Lively, the spy who had sat across the table from these men in his own restaurant. They opened fire without a word of warning. Sid Hatfield was hit again and was dead almost before he understood what was happening. The gold tooth and the quick smile gone in an instant, cut down on a public courthouse staircase in front of his wife. Ed Chambers was shot too, and he tumbled down the stone steps, and he was still alive at the bottom. His wife, Sally, ran to him, and as she reached her husband, one of the agents walked down the steps and shot him again, at close range, as she was trying to hold him. Sally Chambers threw herself at the man. She went at an armed Baldwin Felts agent with her bare hands, screaming, and they knocked her back, and Ed Chambers died there on the ground at the foot of the courthouse he had trusted. Two unarmed men, shot to death on the steps of a courthouse, in front of their wives, by private detectives, in broad daylight, in the middle of an American town. And here is the part that turned grief into something harder and colder in the hearts of every miner who heard it. The men who did the shooting claimed they had acted in self-defense, and they were acquitted. They walked. Nobody paid for it. The law that had summoned Sid Hatfield to Welch and told him to leave his gun at home stood and watched him be murdered on its own front steps, and then it let his killers go home. That was the moment the miners stopped believing that any door was left to them but one. You have to understand what Sid Hatfield had meant. He was not just a man to them. He was the proof that standing up could work, the living evidence that the company's power had a limit, and the operators, with the help of the courts, had reached out and erased that proof on a set of stone steps, and then dared anyone to do something about it. 10,000 men decided to do something about it. The word went out through the coalfields the way fire goes through dry timber. Miners began to gather in the late summer of 1921 in the hills of Kanawha County, near a place called Lenz Creek, And they kept coming, day after day, more and more of them, until the gathering was an army. They came with their own hunting rifles and shotguns and whatever they could carry. They came in their work clothes and their old army uniforms from the war they had just fought for this same country. And to tell each other apart in the fighting they knew was coming, they tied red bandanas around their necks. A whole army of men in red kerchiefs, marching. There are those who will tell you that is where a certain word for a poor country laborer comes from, though the truth of that is argued. What is not argued is the sight of them. Thousands of armed men, red at the throat, moving south through the mountains with a single purpose. They meant to march into Logan and Mingo counties, the heart of the operator's territory, the ununionized fields where the tent families were still freezing and men were still being held in jails. They meant to free the prisoners, organize the mines by force if they had to, and answer for Sid Hatfield. As many as 10,000 of them set out. It was, and it remains, the largest armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. Standing in their way was the sheriff of Logan County, a man named Don Chafin. Don Chafin was the operator's man to the bone, kept in office and kept in money by the coal companies, and he had built himself a private army to match the one marching toward him. He gathered a defensive force, some 3,000 strong, deputies and mine guards and volunteers, paid and armed by the coal operators, and he set them along the high ridges of a long mountain that stood across the miners' path, Blair Mountain. He dug them in along the ridgelines with rifles and with machine guns. And because the operators had money and were determined to hold that line, Chafin's side did something almost no one in America had ever done on their own soil. They hired private airplanes, and they flew them over the miners, and they dropped homemade bombs and gas down onto the men climbing the slopes below. Let that picture sit for a moment. American aircraft dropping explosives on American workers in the mountains of West Virginia in 1921, so that a coal company would not have to bargain over the weight of a ton of coal. The fighting on Blair Mountain went on for days. It stretched across miles of ridge and hollow, thousands of men on each side firing through the trees, the miners pushing up toward the ridgeline again and again, Chafin's men holding the high ground and pouring fire down. The crack of rifles rolled through those mountains without stopping. Estimates of how many rounds were fired run into the millions, and the miners, for all their numbers and all their fury, could not break that fortified line at the top. Then the thing happened that ended it, and it is the bitterest turn in the whole story. The President of the United States, Warren Harding, sent in the United States Army. Federal troops came into the coalfields with orders to end the uprising, and when those soldiers arrived, the miners faced a choice that cut them in half. They had marched to fight the coal operators and Don Chafin's hired guns. They had not marched to fight the United States. Most of these men had worn the uniform of that same army in the war. They would not turn their rifles on American soldiers. And so, with the federal troops closing in, the great army of 10,000 miners simply began to melt away. They lowered their guns. They buried what weapons they could and walked home through the mountains, back to the same company houses, the same company stores, the same scrip, the same debt they had risen up against. The largest labor uprising in American history ended not in victory and not in a last stand, but in 10,000 men quietly deciding they could not, in the end, fire on their own country's flag. How many died on Blair Mountain, no one can tell you. The number was never truly counted. The operators had every reason to keep it small in the record, and the mountains kept their own secrets. And to this day, the true toll is a matter of guesswork. Men were buried where they fell, some of them in graves no one marked. And in the reckoning that came after, it was the miners who stood trial. Hundreds of them were charged. Some were charged with murder. Some were charged with treason against the state of West Virginia, an accusation almost unheard of, tried on the same grounds where John Brown had once been tried. A few were convicted. Most were eventually acquitted or released, but the point had been made, and the point was this. The men had risen up with everything they had, 10,000 strong, and it had not worked. The Union was broken in the southern fields. Membership collapsed, The operators had won, completely, and the coalfields went quiet under their control for another 10 years and more, until a different decade and a different set of laws finally gave the miners what Blair Mountain could not. Which brings us back down the mountain, and back to the beginning, and back to the ledger, and the widow who stood at the company counter asking a question no one would answer. Because while the great battle raged on the ridgelines that summer and fall, the small, quiet dying never stopped for a moment down in the hollows. It never had. Long before Blair Mountain, and long after, the mountain went on killing men the way it always killed them. Not in glory, not in a battle anyone would name. In the dark, under a fall of rock, in an ordinary week, on an ordinary shift. That is how it took Frank Ballard. There was no armored train for him, no courthouse steps, no airplane overhead. There was a low rumble in a tunnel, and a section of roof that came down without warning, the way it came down for thousands of men whose names never reached a newspaper. The company doctor, the one Frank had paid for out of every check for years, came and pronounced him dead. And the company that had rented Frank his house, and sold him his food in its own money, and sold him the powder that brought down the coal, and taken a fee for the doctor who now stood over his body, saw to the burial, on company ground, in a plot the company chose. And when Della Ballard, a widow now, with children and a house she was about to lose, came down to the office in the last week of that year, and asked to know where her husband lay, so she could find the place and mark it and stand over it, she was told the records were company property. She never got the answer. Thousands of women never got the answer. All across those coal fields on hillsides above the tipples, there are unmarked depressions in the ground where miners were laid to rest, and then, in the paperwork that mattered, made to disappear. Men who spent their whole lives being owned, and whose final resting place stayed owned after them, unmarked and unrecorded, so that even in death they added up to nothing on the company's books. That was the true face of it. Not just that the company owned your labor while you lived, but that it reached past the end of your life and owned the ground you were buried in, and kept the map to that ground locked in a ledger you were not allowed to see. The miners lost at Blair Mountain. It is worth saying plainly, because we like our history to end in triumph, and this one does not for a long time. The men who marched went home beaten. The Union collapsed in the South. The scrip kept circling. The store kept its prices. The graves stayed unmarked. But the story did not disappear the way the company wanted it to. It survived in the mouths of the people who lived it, passed down in the hollows, kept alive by the descendants of the men who wore the red bandanas, until the country slowly remembered what had happened in those mountains. Today there is a museum in Matawan, on the same street where the agents fell. Historians walk the ridgeline of Blair Mountain and dig up the spent shells by the thousands, physical proof of a battle the record keepers preferred to shrink. The names that the company tried to erase are being spoken again. And the deepest question the whole story leaves behind is not really about coal at all. It is about what happens to human beings when one power owns everything around them. The home and the wage and the healer and the church and the school and the very earth of the graveyard, until there is no free ground left to stand on. The miners of West Virginia found the answer the hard way. When people are given nothing left to lose, eventually, they will climb a mountain into machine gun fire, rather than keep living on their knees. They will lose, and lose badly, and do it anyway, because there are things worse than losing. Della Ballard walked back up the hollow that winter, without the answer she came for. Somewhere on a hillside above a played-out mine, her husband is still there, in ground that once belonged to a company that is long since gone, under grass that never got a stone. He was owned in life and owned in death, and the men who owned him are dust now too, and their names are on nothing that anyone visits. But we said his story out loud today, and that, in the end, is the one thing they could never quite manage to own. If this is the kind of buried history you want more of, the stories of ordinary people, erased by the powerful, and dug back up into the light, subscribe and stay with this channel. There is another one, waiting for you on screen right now.